"Get out of my way, old-timer." The sharp command cut through the humid air of the SEAL training facility. Samuel Carter, methodically mopping the locker room floor, didn't flinch. His weathered hands gripped the mop handle tighter as Petty Officer Brooks stepped closer, sweat dripping from his workout. "Did you hear me?" Brooks snapped, his voice rising with practiced arrogance. "We need this space cleared. Now." The young SEAL's shadow fell across Samuel's path, but the 72-year-old custodian continued his steady, rhythmic cleaning. His pale gray eyes remained fixed on his work. Other SEALs nearby paused their conversations, sensing confrontation. Brooks's jaw tightened at being ignored. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," he growled, shoving the mop bucket with his boot. Dirty water splashed across the concrete. Samuel finally straightened, his movements deliberate and careful. As he turned to face the young warrior, the collar of his maintenance uniform shifted slightly. For just a moment, faded ink became visible on his neck. A serpent coiled around a trident, barely discernible in the fluorescent lighting. "Before we continue, if you've ever been underestimated because of your age or appearance, type honor below, and tell me where you're watching from." This story of Samuel Carter proves that true heroes often walk among us unrecognized. I read every comment. The locker room at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado buzzed with the typical post-workout energy of elite warriors. Steam rose from hot showers while the youngest generation of Navy SEALs toweled off and shared stories of their latest training exercises. It was here, in this temple of modern warfare, that Samuel Carter had worked quietly for 4 years. He arrived each morning at 0500 before the operators began their day. He swept the mats, where they practiced hand-to-hand combat. He mopped the floors where they changed from civilians into warriors. He cleaned the mirrors that reflected their transformation from boys into SEALs. And he did it all without complaint, without recognition, and most importantly, without anyone knowing who he really was. Brooks wasn't finished with his display of dominance. At 24, he was the epitome of SEAL arrogance, carved from granite, trained to perfection, and utterly convinced of his superiority over anyone not wearing the trident. "You deaf, Pops?" he sneered, stepping closer until he was nearly chest to chest with Samuel. "I said we need this space." Samuel's response was vintage military bearing disguised as civilian submission. He simply nodded and began wringing out his mop, the same methodical movements he'd performed thousands of times. But there was something in his posture, a straightness to his spine, a control in his movements that spoke of different training, older training. "That's more like it," Brooks announced loudly, playing to his audience. "Maybe now you'll remember to stay out of our way." He turned to his fellow SEALs with a smirk. "Old guys like this, they forget their place, think they can wander around wherever they want." What Brooks couldn't see, what none of them could see, was the slight tremor in Samuel's hands as he gripped the mop handle. Not from age or fear, but from restraint. 47 years of civilian life hadn't erased the muscle memory of a man trained to kill with those same weathered hands. The young SEAL was standing inches from a living weapon, mocking him like a harmless old man. Samuel bent to retrieve his cleaning supplies, and as he did, the tattoo on his neck shifted again in the light. The serpent's coils seemed to tighten around the trident, as if responding to the tension in the room. It was faded now, worn by decades of sun and age, but the design remained unmistakable to anyone who knew their history. The underwater demolition teams of the Korean War era didn't hand out participation trophies. They handed out tattoos to the men who survived missions that officially never happened. Master Chief David Patterson had been observing the confrontation from across the locker room with growing unease. At 45, he'd seen enough cocky young operators to know when someone was about to cross a line. But something about the old janitor's reaction, or lack thereof, caught his attention. Patterson pushed off from the wall where he'd been standing, his trained eye noting details others missed. The way Samuel held himself, the controlled breathing, the complete absence of fear in his eyes. These weren't the characteristics of a typical civilian custodian being bullied by a SEAL. "Brooks!" Patterson called out, his voice carrying the authority of 2 decades in special operations. You got somewhere to be? The young SEAL turned, snapping briefly to attention. Just clearing the workspace, Master Chief. Maintenance can finish later. He gestured dismissively at Samuel, who had resumed his methodical cleaning. Mr. Carter's been cleaning this facility since before you earned your trident, Patterson replied quietly. Show some respect. Brooks's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. Being corrected in front of his peers was the worst kind of humiliation for a young operator. Roger that, Master Chief, he said through gritted teeth. But his eyes promised this wasn't over. As Patterson watched Brooks storm off, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with this picture. He'd been around enough combat veterans to recognize certain tells. The way Samuel moved suggested someone who'd been trained not just to clean floors, but to move silently through enemy territory. The way he held his head indicated someone accustomed to scanning for threats, not just dust bunnies. What Patterson didn't know was that Samuel Carter had been watching him too. In the reflection of the polished floor, Samuel had observed the Master Chief's approach, cataloged his threat level, minimal, and noted his protective instincts, admirable. Old habits died hard, even after 47 years of civilian life. 20 minutes later, Brooks returned with 3 of his teammates, ostensibly to retrieve forgotten gear. In reality, he was looking for round 2. Hey there, Grandpa, he called out with false friendliness. You missed a spot over there? He pointed to a perfectly clean section of floor, his buddies snickering behind him. Samuel looked where Brooks was pointing, then back at the young SEAL. No words, no anger, just the patient expression of a man who'd seen real enemies and wasn't impressed by playground bullies. Cat got your tongue? Brooks pressed, emboldened by his audience. Or maybe you're just too old to hear me properly. Should we speak louder? He raised his voice mockingly. Can you understand me? This drew more laughter from his crew, but Patterson noticed something else entirely. As Brooks had been speaking, Samuel's hand had unconsciously moved to touch the spot on his neck, where his collar met his skin. Just a brief gesture, barely noticeable, but it was there. The Master Chief's eyes narrowed. He'd seen that motion before, in old-timers at veteran reunions. Men touching scars, touching tattoos, touching memories they carried on their skin. His grandfather had done the same thing, unconsciously reaching for the shrapnel scar on his shoulder whenever someone mentioned World War II. Brooks, Patterson said sharply. You're done here. Master Chief, you're done. The tone brooked no argument. As the group reluctantly filed out, Patterson remained behind. He approached Samuel, who was still cleaning with the same methodical precision. Mr. Carter, he said quietly, you've been here 4 years. Haven't seen you at any of the veteran gatherings. Samuel looked up, their eyes meeting for the first time. For just a moment, Patterson saw something flicker in those pale gray depths. Recognition, perhaps. The silent acknowledgement that passes between warriors, even decades apart. Not much for crowds anymore, Master Chief, Samuel replied softly. His voice carried the trace of an accent that spoke of a childhood far from California's coast. But what happened next shocked everyone present. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell had just entered the locker room to retrieve her gear when she witnessed the tail end of the confrontation. As the base's senior intelligence officer, she had an eye for details others missed. And something about the elderly custodian immediately caught her attention. It wasn't his age or his humble demeanor that triggered her interest. It was his hands. As Mitchell watched Samuel clean, she noticed calluses in very specific places, the kind of calluses that came from gripping diving equipment, not cleaning supplies, the kind of scarring on knuckles that suggested extensive combat training, not mopping floors. Her grandfather had been a frogman in World War II. She'd grown up studying his hands, memorizing every mark and scar from his service with the underwater demolition teams. Samuel's hands told a similar story. Excuse me, Mitchell said, approaching cautiously. Mr. Carter, isn't it? Samuel looked up, immediately noting her rank and the intelligence insignia on her uniform. His posture straightened almost imperceptibly, the automatic response of an old soldier recognizing an officer. Yes, ma'am. My grandfather served with UDT-21 in the Pacific, she said carefully. He had hands like yours, scars from handling diving equipment in rough conditions. For the first time since the confrontation began, Samuel's composed mask slipped slightly. His eyes widened just a fraction, and his hand unconsciously moved toward his neck again. Mitchell's trained gaze followed the movement, and she caught just a glimpse of what looked like faded ink beneath his collar. "Your grandfather was a brave man, ma'am," Samuel replied quietly. "Those old frogmen, they were the real deal." The way he said it, with the reverence of someone who knew, not someone who'd read about it, sent a chill down Mitchell's spine. She was looking at either the world's most knowledgeable janitor or something else entirely. Master Chief Patterson, still observing from nearby, noticed Mitchell's suddenly intense interest in their custodian. He approached the pair, his own curiosity piqued. "Problem, Commander?" "No problem, Master Chief," Mitchell replied carefully. "Just talking about the old UDT teams." She paused, studying Samuel's face. "Mr. Carter seems to know quite a bit about their operations." Samuel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He was walking dangerous ground now, getting close to subjects he'd spent 47 years avoiding. But something about these two, their genuine respect, their obvious knowledge of naval history, made him willing to venture a step closer to his past. "I had some friends who served," he said simply. "Long time ago. They used to tell stories." "What kind of stories?" Patterson asked, his instincts now fully engaged. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his hands continuing their methodical work. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades. Stories about swimming in the dark, about clearing obstacles that others couldn't even see, about men who went into the water and didn't come back. The silence that followed was profound. Mitchell and Patterson exchanged glances, both thinking the same thing. This wasn't the casual knowledge of someone who'd heard war stories secondhand. This was the intimate familiarity of someone who'd lived them. Mitchell decided to push a little further. "My grandfather mentioned something about special operations during Korea. Teams that operated under different designations than the regular UDT units. Ever hear about anything like that?" Samuel's hands stopped moving. For the first time in the entire encounter, he looked genuinely shaken. The question had hit home in a way that Brooks's bullying never could. He was staring directly at an intelligence officer who was asking about operations that were supposed to remain classified forever. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "there's a lot of stories about Korea that probably shouldn't be repeated." That's when Patterson knew for certain. He was looking at a veteran, and not just any veteran. The way Samuel deflected the question, the way he acknowledged classified operations without confirming or denying, it was textbook operational security from someone who'd been trained never to break cover. What nobody knew was that Samuel Carter's real story was about to emerge from the shadows, whether he wanted it to or not. In the summer of 1952, a 19-year-old farm boy named Samuel Carter arrived at the Naval Training Center in San Diego with $23 in his pocket and a burning desire to serve his country. The Korean War was raging, and like thousands of young Americans, he wanted to make a difference. What he didn't expect was to be selected for a program that didn't officially exist. The recruiters called it Specialized Maritime Operations. The training was conducted at a remote facility north of San Diego, away from the main UDT base. There were no publicity photos, no graduation ceremonies, no proud families in attendance, just 12 young men learning to become ghosts in the water. Samuel excelled at the brutal selection process. While other candidates washed out from the physical demands or the psychological pressure, he endured. He learned to swim impossible distances in freezing water. He mastered the art of underwater demolitions using equipment so primitive it barely qualified as safe. Most importantly, he learned to keep secrets that could get him killed if revealed to the wrong people. The unit was designated UDTX, though they were never referred to by that name in any official documentation. Their missions were given only verbal authorization, their equipment drawn from unmarked supplies, their deployment records classified at the highest levels. They were the prototype for what would eventually become the SEALs, though that designation was still a decade away. Samuel's first and only combat deployment came in October 1952, when North Korean forces had fortified the harbor at Wonsan with a complex array of mines, nets, and underwater obstacles. The main invasion force needed those obstacles cleared before they could land, but conventional minesweepers couldn't operate in such shallow, heavily defended waters. 3 men from UDTX were selected for the mission: Samuel, his best friend Tommy Rodriguez from Texas, and their squad leader, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Johnson. They called themselves the Mako Unit, after the shark, swift, deadly, and operating in the deep. The night of the operation, the 3 men slipped into the frigid waters of the Korean coast from a submarine positioned 2 miles offshore. They carried no breathing apparatus, no radios, no backup equipment. Their only tools were waterproof explosives, cutting equipment, and the kind of courage that comes from knowing your country depends on your success. Samuel could still remember the bone-chilling cold of that water, how it seemed to leach the life from his body within minutes. He remembered the taste of salt and fear as they swam through underwater minefields in complete darkness, guided only by compass and instinct. Most clearly, he remembered Tommy Rodriguez's last words before they separated to tackle different sections of the obstacle field. "See you on the beach, brother," Tommy had whispered through blue lips. "Don't you dare leave without me." Samuel never saw Tommy again, or Chief Johnson. The explosions that cleared the harbor obstacles also attracted every North Korean patrol boat within 5 miles. Samuel spent 6 hours in the water, dodging searchlights and gunfire, fighting hypothermia and exhaustion, swimming toward a rendezvous point where no submarine waited. The official record showed that UDTX had suffered casualties during a training exercise in San Diego Bay. Samuel Carter was listed as the sole survivor of an equipment failure that claimed 2 lives. The successful clearing of Wonsan Harbor was credited to aerial bombardment and minesweepers. The truth was buried so deep that even Samuel sometimes wondered if it had really happened, but the tattoo on his neck remembered. The serpent coiled around the trident wasn't just ink. It was a memorial to Tommy Rodriguez and Marcus Johnson, and to a mission that saved thousands of American lives while taking 2 of the best men Samuel had ever known. For 47 years, he'd carried that secret alone, cleaning floors and emptying trash cans while the world forgot that men like Tommy and Marcus had ever existed. What he didn't know was that the secret was about to come to light. Admiral Robert Harrison, commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, was reviewing personnel files in his office when his secure phone rang. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's voice was tight with barely controlled excitement. "Admiral, I need you to come to the SEAL facility immediately. We have a situation that requires your personal attention." "What kind of situation, Commander?" "Sir, I believe we may have identified a member of UDTX working as a custodian on the base." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 10 seconds. Admiral Harrison had been briefed on UDTX during his promotion to flag rank. The classified files made for sobering reading, brave men conducting impossible missions with primitive equipment and no recognition. Most of the unit's records had been destroyed decades ago for security reasons. "That's impossible," Harrison finally said. "UDTX was disbanded in 1953. All personnel were transferred or discharged." "Sir, I've spent the last hour reviewing archived records. Samuel Carter, age 72, has been employed here for 4 years. His official service record shows basic UDT training, but there are gaps in his file that coincide exactly with UDTX operational periods." Harrison was already reaching for his hat. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Don't let him leave." When the Admiral arrived at the SEAL facility, he found a small crowd gathered around the elderly custodian. Samuel was still working, seemingly oblivious to the growing attention, but his movements had become increasingly tense. He could sense something was happening, even if he didn't understand what. Admiral Harrison approached slowly, his experienced eye taking in every detail. Samuel's posture, his bearing, the way he held himself despite his age, it all spoke of military training that went far beyond basic service. When their eyes met, Harrison saw something that confirmed his suspicions. The look of a man who'd seen combat, who'd lost brothers, who'd carried secrets for decades. "Mr. Carter," Harrison said quietly, I'm Admiral Harrison. I'd like to speak with you privately. Samuel's hand moved unconsciously toward his neck, touching the place where his tattoo lay hidden beneath his collar. Is there a problem, sir? No problem. Just some questions about your service record. The two men walked to a quiet corner of the facility, away from the curious SEALs and staff members. Harrison's next words changed Samuel's life forever. Tell me about Tommy Rodriguez and Marcus Johnson. Samuel's face went white. Those names hadn't been spoken aloud in his presence for 47 years. His hands trembled as the memories came flooding back. The cold Korean water, the explosions, the desperate swim to nowhere, the realization that his brothers weren't coming home. How do you... Samuel's voice cracked. Those names are classified. Show me your neck, son. With hands that shook from decades of suppressed emotion, Samuel unbuttoned his collar and pulled it back. There, faded but unmistakable, was the tattoo that had marked him as one of the Navy's most elite warriors. A serpent coiled around a trident, the unofficial insignia of UDTX, the Mako unit. Admiral Harrison stared at the tattoo with something approaching reverence. He was looking at a living piece of naval history, a man whose courage had helped secure one of the most important military victories of the Korean War. Samuel Carter, Harrison said, his voice thick with emotion. On behalf of the United States Navy, I want to thank you for your service, and I want to apologize for the years of silence. Samuel's composure finally broke. 47 years of carrying the secret alone, of wondering if Tommy and Marcus had died for nothing, of cleaning floors while younger men received the recognition that should have been his. It all came out in a flood of tears that he'd been holding back for nearly half a century. They were good men, sir, he whispered. The best men I ever knew. I know, Harrison replied, and it's time the world knew too. Within hours of Admiral Harrison's revelation, the entire atmosphere at the Naval Amphibious base had changed. Word spread quickly through the tight-knit community of SEALs and support staff. The quiet janitor they'd seen every day for 4 years was a genuine American hero. Petty Officer Brooks, who had initiated the confrontation that led to Samuel's exposure, found himself face-to-face with Admiral Harrison in the base commander's office. The young SEAL's arrogance had evaporated completely, replaced by the crushing weight of his actions. "Do you understand what you did today?" Harrison asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Sir, You humiliated a man who completed one of the most dangerous missions in naval history. A man who watched his best friends die in the service of this country while he continued the mission. A man who has spent 47 years in silence, carrying secrets that could have gotten him killed if revealed at the wrong time." Brooks was pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "Admiral, I had no idea." "No, you didn't, because you judged a book by its cover. You saw an old man with a mop and assumed he was beneath you." Harrison leaned forward. "Let me tell you something about Mr. Carter. While you were learning to tie your shoes, he was swimming through North Korean minefields with explosives strapped to his body. While you were playing high school football, he was keeping secrets that protected ongoing intelligence operations. While you were earning your trident, he was emptying your trash cans and cleaning your toilets, never asking for recognition or respect. The punishment was swift and comprehensive. Brooks was formally reprimanded, assigned to remedial duties under Samuel's direct supervision, and required to complete a mandatory course on naval history with special emphasis on the UDT teams and their contributions to modern warfare. More importantly, Admiral Harrison authorized the immediate declassification of Samuel's service record and the restoration of honors that had been delayed for nearly half a century. The Navy Cross that should have been awarded in 1952 was finally authorized for presentation, along with the Purple Heart for wounds sustained during the Wonsan operation that had never been officially acknowledged. The ceremony took place 1 week later in front of the entire SEAL Command. Samuel Carter, wearing a dress blue uniform for the first time since his discharge in 1954, stood at attention as Admiral Harrison read the citation for his Navy Cross. For extraordinary heroism during naval operations against enemy forces in North Korea. Petty Officer Carter, operating as part of a three-man underwater demolition team, successfully cleared enemy obstacles from Wonsan Harbor under extreme enemy fire, enabling the landing of United Nations forces. Despite the loss of his teammates and severe enemy opposition, Petty Officer Carter completed his mission and evaded capture through 6 hours of sustained enemy pursuit. His actions directly contributed to the success of the Wonsan landing and saved countless American lives. As the medal was pinned to his uniform, Samuel's thoughts turned to Tommy Rodriguez and Marcus Johnson. This recognition belonged to them as much as it did to him. They had died as unknown heroes, but their sacrifice would finally be acknowledged. The ceremony concluded with a surprise that nobody, including Samuel, had expected. Master Chief Patterson stepped forward carrying a ceremonial flag folded in the traditional triangle. "On behalf of the families of Tommy Rodriguez and Marcus Johnson," he announced, "the Navy would like to present this flag to the last surviving member of the Mako unit, in recognition of the brotherhood that transcends death and honors the sacrifice of all who served." Samuel accepted the flag with tears streaming down his face. For the first time in 47 years, he wasn't carrying his burden alone. The standing ovation from the assembled SEALs lasted for 5 full minutes. These modern warriors understood what their predecessors had endured to make their own service possible. 3 months after the ceremony, Samuel Carter's story had become legend throughout Naval Special Warfare Command. The elderly custodian was offered retirement with full honors, but he chose to stay. However, his role changed significantly. Instead of cleaning floors, Samuel became the official historian for Naval Special Warfare Command, tasked with preserving the stories of the men who had served in units like UDTX. His first project was establishing a memorial wall honoring Tommy Rodriguez and Marcus Johnson, ensuring that their names would never be forgotten again. Petty Officer Brooks underwent a remarkable transformation during his month of working under Samuel's supervision. The young SEAL learned more about naval history, military bearing, and genuine leadership from the old custodian than he had in all his previous training combined. By the end of his remedial assignment, Brooks had become one of Samuel's most devoted advocates. "He taught me that real strength isn't about how much you can lift or how fast you can swim," Brooks explained to his fellow SEALs. "It's about how you carry yourself when nobody's watching and how you treat people who can't do anything for you." The mandatory naval history course that Admiral Harrison had instituted became one of the most popular educational programs on the base. Samuel's quiet lectures about the early days of underwater warfare drew capacity crowds, with SEALs hanging on every word of the man who had lived the history they were studying. But perhaps the most important change was in Samuel himself. After 47 years of silence, he was finally able to talk about Tommy and Marcus, to share their stories and ensure their sacrifice was remembered. The burden that had weighed on him for nearly half a century was finally lifted. To everyone who typed honor and shared where you're watching from, thank you for standing with our heroes. Subscribe for more stories like this and unsung American heroes. See you in the next one.